Hi,
Right.
everybody. This is Joel Harrison with the Alternative Guitar Summit, and I'm here with Fareed Haque. Now, the first thing is, even though I've known you for quite a while, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing your name properly. How do you pronounce the end, the last three
Man,
letters of
I've
your
gotten
name?
so many over the years. Haque, Hakui, Hoke, Hake. It's just Huck. Huck.
Haque. Got it.
It's like laying a
So,
hocker on you.
so I first saw Fareed play way too late in life with the Billy Cobham band that came through New York about 4 years ago with my good friend Paul Hansen on bassoon. And we've been talking a lot and collaborating since then. And one of the things that we've been doing is Fareed contributed a track to the Pat Martino tribute that I did with High Note Records that came out, I think, about a year ago. And Fareed, it turns out, has written, or I should say, recorded all of Pat's music from the Joyous Lake Project with his own smoking group from Chicago. So, amongst other things that I'd love to talk about, I want to talk about Pat Martino with you, beloved by so many guitar fans and recently deceased. And people are looking ever more closely at him because I think he's one of those artists that's going to last and blossom over time because of what an important player and writer he was.
Yeah.
And I think you're one of the people who has a lot to say about what Pat brought to the guitar and what we can learn from Pat Martino. And having said that, I would like to turn it over to you and ask you to talk a little bit about what it means to us aspiring musicians to emulate Pat's feel and Pat's some of Pat's lines, uh, his wholly original, beautiful, and roots based and yet modernistic sound.
Yeah, I really appreciate having the opportunity, Joel, to to talk on this subject because it's an interesting eh, topic on so many levels. I think for musicians in general, for guitarists, um, and uh, and I should maybe start with a little bit of history. Um, I've always been interested in world music, but rooted in jazz, and as a result, uh, my musical life and career has been sort of all over the place, and that's been a real pleasure for me um, to have this sort of ethnic background. My dad is from India, my mom is from South America. So I was exposed to a lot of world music, but then I was growing up in Chicago, going to the jam sessions on the South Side, and so you know, through no fault of my own, I was given this incredible and unique perspective on jazz. In the tradition of it, the roots of it. Going to the sessions on the South Side with Von Freeman, uh, Eddie Johnson, John Logan. So many great musicians from that scene, and really not realizing how much I was absorbing of those South Side, traditional jazz roots, and then going out to play world music and classical music, and then finding that there were a lot of connections there. Um, as I began to get so overwhelmed with so many different styles of music, I started to say, well, hey, who are the models that I can see out there that I can use to study and to learn from, to make this journey a little more manageable. Um, and I began to see that there were players that had uh, qualities to their musicianship that I valued and appreciated. John Williams, the classical guitarist, was very interested in world music. He was playing Barrios, was playing all this music, but still had a real dedication to the classical tradition. And I began to see these parallels. There were a lot of great jazz guitarists out there, and some were more rock oriented, more fusion oriented. But I always found that the musicians that attracted me the most were the ones that had some connection to tradition and roots, but yet were able to relate to world music, to modern music. John McLaughlin comes to mind as someone who is a jazz player, can play changes, but really understands world music and Indian style, rock music. And so I was very attracted to John's music as a young musician. Paco de Lucia, Al Di Meola were all fascinating to me. But Pat Martino was fascinating because of all of the players that were available to listen and to kind of get to know. Pat's feel was so unique, so rootsy, right, and yet modern. And that was something that I think, and maybe we'll speak a little more plainly here, since this is something that's meant for probably other guitarists, other musicians. A lot of great players out there, but kind of nobody swung like Pat. And those who did swing like Pat didn't really play modern music, modern jazz, in that post Charlie Parker, Wayne and Freddie and Chick and Herbie and all that hip shit that we all love. Where was the jazz guitar and all that? There wasn't any jazz guitar. There was rock guitar in that. There was Coryell playing great rock guitar, or a handful of really nice modern players. And the closest really you got to a modern sound was Grant Green. And here was a guy who had an amazing feel, but really a very traditional language. And so Pat Martino was like piano players. We had Chick Corea, we had Herbie, we had Zawinul, we had, down the road, there's just so many players that, Chick has a very unique feel, but no one can say that Chick ain't swinging, right? That shit is swinging hard, and it's totally modern. Herbie, of course, redefined, funk in the 70s, and still never lost, an iota of his roots. And then, most of the guys guitar players who were really playing in that scene didn't have that swing feel. They might have had chops, but they didn't have that swing feel that Pat Martino brought to the table. So he was a singular figure that attracted me. He was the one cat who bridged all those styles. In fact, he was even interested in classical music in some ways as a composer. And even though he played plectrum style, he wrote a number of etudes that were very classical oriented. So there was an attraction there for me. And I just loved, the sounds he was getting. And the more I began to get into what Pat does, I did it kind of in a different way. I think a lot of young musicians today, if they have someone they emulate, the first thing they do is transcribe. And I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily, but I think sometimes people get so focused on the little picture, I want to sound like so-and-so, that they don't see their connection to the bigger picture. And if you don't see their connection to the bigger picture, you kind of can't get there. I'll give you a great example. I had a wonderful student, a fantastic guitarist, and he came to me at the university on a scholarship, and he played a white 175, right? And he played, everything was diatonic, and I thought, oh, this kid really digs Pat Metheny. He's playing kind of modally, he's playing all these nice scales. And we started talking. I said, man, if you dig Pat Metheny, we should do X, Y, and Z and go in that direction, And he's like, wow, wait a second, whoa. I dig Pat Metheny, but I want to sound like Wes. I said, oh, well, you can't get there from there. right? You're not going to reverse engineer Pat Metheny to get to West. If you want to get to West, you got to start in Charlie Christian. You got to go through Bird, and that sound, and then translate that to the guitar, and then you'll be there. I mean, there's a bebop vocabulary that we're talking about in that context, and it was hilarious because, he was so focused on what he wanted that he was missing the bigger picture. And the moment he had the bigger picture, I mean, talented kid. I mean, it was a matter of a few months before he was like in the zone, right? Doing what he wanted to do. Another interesting example that I think is relevant to this discussion, and feel free, Joel, to chime in with questions because I can keep going.
Well, yeah, I'm curious what if you show us. You played a lot of Pat's music. Show us what you mean when you say that roots feeling.
Sure. That roots feeling to me starts from the blues, and that's one of the things that is fascinating about Pat is that he came from the blues. So coming from the blues, missing all that modal Berkeley shit that was so popular around the late 70s and early 80s, right? Coming right from the blues, right to the modern music. That was fascinating to me because that's what I was doing. I went from Von Freeman sessions and that kind of Chicago Chitlin circuit scene, little taste that I had of that, and didn't realize how much it had affected me. Now I was listening to all this world music and I began to see, wow, there's a lot more connections there than to all this other stuff. So, if I was playing a blues, I'm going to start with the blues scale. Right? I might play, and then, now that sounds like a lick, but it is a lick, but that sounds also like the major blues scale, right? So everything that's outlining those changes is coming from the blues scale, right? And I think the problem guitar players get into is that we get stuck in, is this the blues or is this jazz? And that can't be a question for us jazz musicians. Everything is blues and everything is jazz, right? And so what I noticed about Pat was that, now keep in mind that the way Pat talks about Pat has nothing to do with what Pat's actually doing, to be perfectly honest. Pat did not have a formal musical education in the same way that so many other musicians had. So his language was something that he kind of invented on his own. So you have to listen to what his words and kind of translate a little bit into what we commonly use, terminology that we commonly use.
Yeah.
But for the most part, we talk in the modal jazz world, about 7 modes for the major scales, right? And then 7 modes for the minor, melodic minor, natural minor. And all of a sudden we're like, just, so deep into scales. And then we start adding chromaticism. So we take, and then we're like, start adding chromaticism to that line. And then we can start to build lines that way. And that can kind of work. It does work. But instead of taking a 7-note scale and adding 5 notes, what I noticed with Pat Martino was that, and Charlie Christian, and many of the earlier players, but they were taking a 5-note scale and adding in 7 notes. It's a real simple idea that makes a lot more sense if you're starting with the blues, right? Eventually you're going to go, because that's part of that language, right?
So what's the 7-note scale you're referring to then, or the 5 notes plus 2?
5-note is just the regular blues scale, right? And as you start, adding notes to that scale, you start creating bebop lines. But some subtle different things happen. The blues scale, major blues scale, if you want to start there, doesn't have the 4th or the 7th, right? The tritones, the guide tones that we are always rant and raving on, those are not in that scale. Someone like Charlie Christian used that scale a lot, and I'm not only guitar players, but any trad jazz player would have used that scale a lot. What happens is you're not given the 4th. You've got to choose the 4th. I want to fill it in, or right? In the moment I have to make that choice as a young player, that's some ear training that's going on that's pretty heavy, right? If I'm given that scale, 7 notes, when do I not use the 7th? Now I got to switch keys to, or that's Lydian flat 7. How does that interface with D major or G? You know what I mean? I'm already, if I'm a 10-year-old kid, I'm out. I'm done. Yeah. I don't understand what you're talking about. But if I got this, which is the same scale that I'm using for my Led Zeppelin tune, right, on some level, and I've got to start filling by ear, I'm starting to create those patterns. If I've got to pick a 7th, or right? So what I noticed, and actually it's funny because I learned how to play scales the same way. And my suspicion is that many, many early guitarists played the same way. They didn't learn 7-note scales and then fill them in. They learned 5-note scales, particularly the more rootsy players, Benson, Grant Green, Charlie Christian.
Mm-hmm.
The who didn't have access to sort of the Eurocentric guitar school, the Joe Passes, the Al Caiolas, all the Tommy Tedesco's, all those Italians who were playing guitar the way they played it in the old country, and so you're starting to fill in these blues scales. And when I learned scales, I did the same thing. I started with, right? And so I had, and then I went, and it wasn't ear for me at that point. It was just like, how could I fill in this thing and make more notes out of it, right? And I was, unbeknownst to myself, I was already training myself to hear the 7th and the 4th as something I could choose. Now that's important, because we're taught when we play a standard, if it says C major 7 and you're in Berkeley or you're in Miami or North Texas like I was, you better play a B natural. If you're hearing this chord, you better play, right? If you're hearing this chord, you better play, right? But that's not really how it is in the real world, is it? If you're hearing 1-6-2-5. All I'm doing is playing around the blues scale. I'm not even thinking about chord changes.
Right.
And all of those notes are notes that you add in. Like when you hear that sixth chord, if you're playing, and all those little kind of triady things really are just coming out of the blues scale.
Yeah.
So
So
you're taking it halfway.
but the other thing you're doing that's sounds so much like the way Pat approached things is what you're doing with your right hand and the way you're attacking the notes. And there's Pat picked a lot of his notes. He, didn't slur nearly as much as a lot of the other guitarists. And I think that's something that many, many people have tried to emulate, and it's incredibly difficult.
So that's an absolutely spot on point. I spent a lot of time thinking about that. I love George Benson's feel, but I was playing a lot of all kinds of music, right? A lot of people are going to hate me for this, but I don't care. When you play like this, you have some really huge advantages to playing swung notes in general, right? Because your upstrokes, believe me, I like to play like this once in a while. Now, I'm not very good at it. I mean, there's a lot of cats who really play this way. Great. Bobby Broom, Corey Christiansen. Who's that? What's his name? This cat has been posting a bunch from Columbus, Ohio. Anyway, I'll remember his name. Really great player. He plays like this. And it sounds great, because your upstrokes come on the offbeat and they get accented, right? The problem with that is it's much harder to play an even scale, right? Not impossible, but harder. I was playing McLaughlin, I was playing Di Meola, I was playing Latin music, I was playing a lot of straight eighth note music, and it was just orders of magnitude easier to play this way and get an even articulation and have control over that. Then I finally found a video of Grant Green, and to me Grant is the funkiest of all of them, right? I love George, love Kenny, love all those guys, but I even love Pat and John McLaughlin and all those guys, but man, when Grant starts, everybody stand back, right? And I noticed that he plays this way. He doesn't play this way. I always assumed that Grant played this way, It's a big guy. It's hard to reach around the guitar. You got to kind of do this thing, do the reach around, right? But Grant was playing this way, and I was like, okay, I'm done. I'm sold. That's it. So I really committed myself to playing this way, and a couple things are important. First of all, for the most part, you always want to play on the side of the pick. So you want, you want to be glancing off the pick, not, but I'm at almost a 45-degree angle, right? And now I would do this with all my students. Regardless of how you're holding the pick, you need to be able to engage your elbow. You need to be able to engage your wrist. You need to be able to engage your fingers. Those are the three components that we have to figure out how we're going to use them. Regardless of how we hold the pick, those are the three major issues that we have to kind of arrange in our technique. So, the biggest thing for me was playing this way allowed me to think of the pick and of the guitar more percussively, right? Because I could go 1, 2, and 3, 4, 1, or I could go takadimi, 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 that Indian stuff that I was doing, But I could also put the weight of my wrist and my hand into it and get that thing going on, that was meat and potatoes for me. I needed to have that. So to me, this approach gives you that flexibility. And what I do is I practiced this a lot when I was a little kid. It's stupid, but I practiced it a ton. I practiced this in front of the TV for hours. Because I didn't know what else to do. So I just did this. And then
I still do that.
And then because all it was taking these notes and filling in with either this finger, this way, or that way. Whatever I could fill in. I didn't know what those scales were. I didn't really care. I just was filling it in to make more stuff, more stuff to play. Stuff that was sounding like what I was hearing on the records and the radio and stuff. So I practiced that a lot, and I found that I could get a lot of speed this way. The thinner the pick, the thinner your tone, but the faster you can play in some cases. So if I was playing with a thinner pick, like this is a little thinner pick I just happen to have here, so it doesn't sound so much, but you can do that. But what you notice is there's no articulation. Everything's the same articulation. That wasn't exciting to me. What's exciting to me, and what I heard in Pat Martino, and Grant Green for that matter, was articulation. The wrist gives you the weight. The finger gives you the articulation. So if I'm playing, you can see a little pull and tug.
Yeah.
Right from here, and that gives you a little bit of that spank, right?
It's interesting. So many teachers talk about left-hand technique position, especially if you're growing up playing classical. But as distinct from classical guitar training, where there's also a lot of discussion about generating tone from your fingers, I don't think a lot of people talk about what you're talking about: pick angle, how to use the whole arm, including the fingers. Just sort of lean your right hand forward a little so we can really see it, and play some kind of slow lines so we kind of see the mechanics of what you're talking about there. Yeah. Yeah. So talk a little bit about the coordination between your left and right hand.
What's that?
Because talk a little bit about the coordination between your left and your right hand, because there's an exact kind of time feel that you have. That's not the right language. You have a very forward sounding picking technique that's very precise and beautiful. Doesn't mean by precise it's not swinging, but I know from personal experience that takes real coordination with the tiny increments of movement in your left hand to get that accuracy so that each note is going to come out strong. And clearly Pat had to have thought a lot about that.
I agree 100%, and I think that certainly practicing to have the hands come together is important. But I think and I may be wrong about this, but my opinion is that it's less about technique and more about uh, playing a lot with drums and bass
Hmm.
and knowing where to lay back and where to play ahead. And that's a language. And I
Yeah,
think
but
a lot of
that I want to come back to that. But unlike, well, me, for instance, when you're playing a pretty fast line, you don't flub any notes. So that what I'm talking about is the kind of pinpoint accuracy of the timing of,
mm.
of your phrases.
And honestly, I still struggle with that. I mean, I still I hear back things that I've played and I'm just like, oh, that's not right. A lot of it to me is, well, again, it does come back to, I think, conception and implementation of that conception. I think a lot of players hear this, let's accent 2 and 4 and it's jazz. I don't really buy that.
I don't think of it that way. That's a little too rigid. I'm just talking about literally.
No, well, let me. I totally hear what you're saying. I believe that just like James Brown said, jazz is about the one,
Uh-huh.
right? So if I'm going to play 1, 2, and 3, and 4, right, and everything bounces off the one, ba da da da, or bop bop boop ba 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 da da, right? Right?
Granted, but a feel aside, you're still executing that with really extreme accuracy. It's really hard to do. And I got around this because my right hand has always been weaker than my left. I always was attracted to pull offs and slurs anyway. And
Sure.
it's funny, John Schofield was teaching at the camp this summer, and somebody asked him, "What do you practice now?" And it's such a great question. The guy's 70 years old. He's had this incredible career, but he said, "Well, I practice all the time. First of all, still not as much as I used to, but I'm always just practicing what I'm not good at." And somebody said, "Well, what's that?" And he talked about the very thing we're talking about. See, I'm still trying to, pick more accurately with my right hand. So I practice, doing what you just did. Because with Sko, it's pull of hammer on,
Right.
incredible sort of left hand legato thing. But
I
that's
love
not what Pat did, and that's not what you're doing, and it's a very different sound. And I'm just wondering how you built that technique, what kind of exercises you did, if there was anything specific to get that
And I
level of
think
accuracy.
that's where the slight disconnect comes up. It's like I don't practice. I literally don't practice at all.
Well, you did at some point, I
I
hope.
did at some point. No, you're right. And
That's
I don't say
fine.
that to be arrogant. I say that to make a point,
Yeah.
which is I don't practice that. Like I literally haven't touched electric guitar in 2 months or in a month. I've been playing only classical, as you know, because we've been doing that other thing,
Yeah.
right? And I'm always surprised that I don't really lose chops, right? I mean, I get a little tighter, but it's not like the deal breaker.
Yeah.
But I spent a ton of time thinking about where the accents go and singing those lines, right?
Uh-huh.
And I spent a lot of time playing percussion. And I had a lesson with a flamenco player in Spain when I was 14, and he played this crazy flamenco scale with all, and it was just like ridiculous from the bottom to the top of the guitar. And I said, "Man, how do you learn how to do this?" He said, "Well, first you have to know how to sing it." And I was like, "Yeah, yeah, that thing again, right?" And then he literally sang it in solfege syllables at tempo,
Uh-huh.
and I was like, "Whoa!" Right?
Wow.
And then I started going to the Indian cats that I was working with, and it was like takadimi, 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 doom. All of a sudden, I went takadimi, and I went, you know, doom. It was clearer in my brain. And so the neural impulses was clear. And the moment that became clear, right? That thing. But it sounds horrible when I sing it, but you know, get the idea. Right? That became really clear. I did have chops, but I had no control over them. So I literally, this is all I ever practiced. I'm not even exaggerating, but like hours. The thicker pick slows you down.
Are you experiencing any tension in your right arm when you do that up here?
Yes.
Because that gets to me. I just tighten up when I try to pick a lot. I mean, I'm older now. It didn't used to be so
That's a
bad.
technique discussion that's a little separate, but an important one. When people tell you to play relaxed, they're full of shit.
Uh,
When they tell you to play relaxed, it doesn't make any sense. If I'm gonna be relaxed, this is it. I'm going down. I'm going down. I'm relaxed. No,
right.
there's tension in just sitting on a chair, right?
Yeah.
So tension is a dynamic. It's about releasing the tension. So if I play this, I'm gonna start getting tighter. Right. Breathe, right? It's gonna get tighter. Now I gotta relax. It's gonna get tighter, and and eventually it's gonna get tired, right? So relax. Relax.
It's a great exercise. It's so simple. But what so many of us have problems with is upstrokes. Because you've got real accuracy to your upstroke. I notice that when students, and I include myself in this, when I'm flubbing a note, it's often the upstroke. So did you ever work on dealing with the strength of the upstroke?
I was very I'm classical technique is very straight up and down, you know, and I always emulated that in my picking. I think Al Di Meola, you know, has an excellent take on that sort of more classical approach. You know, that again, it's part of that Italian school. You know, all those Italian guys who played, you know, and Pat in a way is part of that school too. He's the best mix of Italian and Chitlin, you know.
Right.
And so for me, and I notice a lot of students have trouble with this, they don't make a careful study of the downstroke and the upstroke being exact opposites of each other, right? They're exact opposites of each other. A lot of folks will play this and then they'll do this for the upstroke, right? And now you're cooked. The moment you have to, you know, I'm exaggerating, but the moment there's any kind of engagement in the wrist for the upstroke that's different from the downstroke, you're never going to be able to play faster than you can move your elbow because the wrist is now out of the picture. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's got to be exactly the same. And that I've sat with a lot of students a lot. And I find that many of them get into the habit of their upstroke not being the same as their downstroke. So my discussion about the right hand pick is that the pick should go, I mean, the strings are all in a plane, right? So any picking on some level has to enter the plane of the strings and leave the plane of the strings. So picking is not just going through the string, it's going down into the plane of the strings, through the strings, and up again. Down, through, and up. Right? Which is it's like a staple, it's like a U, but with very sharp corners. You're going to go. And so I spent a lot of time doing that. Down, through, and up. Down, through, and up. Down, through, and up. And eventually it becomes a U, right? Or a J. Because there's this picking up of the wrist with each note. That's like Pat does that kind of stuff, so I could tell that he was doing that kind of approach to picking, you know, where he would come on each note. And I would spend time going slowly down, through, and up, down, through, and up, down, through, and up, down, through, and up. What you start to get is the weight of the hand in the note. So not only do you get this, but you also get I can swing more. See, if you're only in the plane of the string, right, how much follow through can you have before you hit the next string? You've got that much follow. So people start talking about minimum motion, right? Same thing with classical guitar. People start talking about minimum motion and they end up with focal dystonia and tendinitis, right? Whereas if you really watch the cats, that finger's going quite far, you know, it'll be from here or from here. Now the same principle that I'm taking from classical applying to the pick, you need to have a follow through that is unimpeded, right? So I can play. My dynamic range now is pretty huge compared to most electric guitarists who are playing with a clean sound, right? And that's because of that upstroke and downstroke being very much the same, practicing this U, and then being able to exploit that now follow through that's available to us.
Yeah.
So I can make a big, soft up downstroke or a loud upstroke. And it's pretty accurate because of the fact that I'm lifting, right?
Yeah.
Now, I prioritized articulation and dynamics over speed, right? If you want pure speed, like a heavy metal player, pure speed, you get rid of all that. You play with a thinner pick.
Yeah.
It's kind of mutually exclusive.
Lighter strings turn up.
And I mean, lighter strings turn up, but also no articulation. My fingers are not involved at all. There's no dynamic. It's not really jazz to me.
Yeah.
Right? And those players who, I was at this festival, and man, there were so many great players with chops. But all of them, they'd be swinging, and then they'd start playing fast, and the swing would go out the window. Right? Not because they didn't have the concept, but because the moment they wanted to play fast, it was like they would go into like bucket mode, where it was just they're going to put all the notes in a bucket and just pour them out, you know, and that was never that interesting to me because it doesn't really have that funky feel. You know?
So play one of the more right hand intensive Pat Martino heads from Joyous Lake that you've been doing, and let's watch you. And admire your ability to play that kind of chops heavy music.
I'm on the spot now. Okay. Let me do that again.
Wow, that's amazing. I don't know what Pat was doing at the time, but it seemed like he had taken some deep dive into Slanimsky thesaurus, or these scales that are not necessarily made up of seven notes, Messiaen scales or something, because all of that is so coming from bebop in a way, but it's super modern harmony.
Well, and that's I think when we left the harmony discussion earlier in our talk here, I was going to head to that because Pat's whole thing of converting to minor is essentially a way for him to retain his blues vocabulary over modern harmonies.
Hmm.
And all of the great players were doing that with pentatonics, right? McCoy, Wayne, Chick, obviously, Herbie, maybe to a lesser extent, but still, Freddie, Woody Shaw, right? They're all playing pentatonics, and we forget that pentatonics is like the most essential. It seems weird to me that we'd say, oh, well, people went from pentatonics in the swing era, and then they just abandoned pentatonics for 30 years, and then they came back to pentatonics suddenly without warning. That seems absurd to me. It's more like there's a continuum here, and if you kind of embrace this idea of building bebop from pentatonics, then you have that continuum,
Ah, okay.
right?
Yeah.
And I think that's sort of what I'm trying to get at is Pat, because he was this, I mean, just to be blunt, this Italian kid from that neighborhood, and all those kids were playing Italian style guitar with mandolin chops, you know what I mean? But he was playing on that other side of town. He got that double dose, and it's very similar to my thing. I had this ethnic background, Hispanic and Indian. And then almost I'm going to the south side of Chicago, and
Right.
getting a dose of that. And so that's where I think that parallel comes in.
Yeah. Let's
But
talk about. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
so, for example, if I'm playing, Pat has right D minor, right? Now A7. So all that is the same lick. You dig? But D minor, A7 is B flat minor. Right? It's the same exact lick, but in B flat minor over the A7 chord, right?
Sure.
And Pat had kind of worked a lot of that stuff out, and he literally would transform, every chord into a minor chord, which essentially is transforming it into a blues scale.
Well, but the B flat minor, that's the altered scale over an A7 using the B flat melodic minor.
Right. He didn't necessarily think about that.
No, I'm sure he
He
did.
just thought about it as, and here's the key here is that he would put all that in there. Estoy grabando. Necesito silencio, por favor. Let's go back a second. I had to tell my
B flat melodic minor, to me, I'm playing that over an A7, and that's the altered scale. So no,
right, but the thing is, Pat would do this thing, which is he would use the entire B flat minor lexicon of bebop licks, over A7, which meant that he was laying very heavily on A7 on he'd be playing A flats right over an A7 chord.
interesting.
And that theoretically is a no-no, right? Pat didn't care at all, and it sounds hip. And we always hear that line, we go, oh, that's the one. And that's what he's doing. It's like that minor 7 sound is laid over a half diminished chord,
I
laid
see. So
over
it's
a
not like
dominant
he
chord.
was always doing the melodic minor. He was sometimes just doing good old natural minor
Exactly.
or Dorian.
And the more I listen to the tunes, particularly on Joyous Lake, but on any of his records, the more you realize a complete disregard for this seventh and fourth lining up with the changes that we always get hung up on in Berkeley style theory.
Yeah.
Right? That this scale has to line up with that chord. Man, rarely. And there's examples even in the melodies of the tunes where the tunes are very strongly invoking notes that aren't in the chords,
Wow.
that are, you know, cross relations that are actually clashing, but they're so melodic and so strong that it sounds hip. It sounds unbelievably hip.
Wow.
And so, if I'm playing, there's a version on one of my records of Giant Steps, um, where I took Pat's concept and applied it to another standard. So Pat would play, instead of playing, right? Pat would have taken B major and thought of it as A flat minor. D7, thought of it as A minor, right? G major, thought of it as E minor.
Mhm.
B flat 7, F minor. And then E flat, C minor. And F sharp 7, C sharp minor, right? So instead of playing, so you're getting, we love that sound, but it's very hard to play that on guitar,
Yeah.
right? Every guitar player knows that, oh, Giant Steps is like ridiculous, right? But if Pat were to play this, it changes the whole discussion. And you're still in your minor world,
Wow.
right?
That's something I definitely never thought of. That's
And,
really
and
cool.
and if you do that to, I mean, a lot of players did this. Von Freeman, I'm sitting there at the end of the night, one night, and Von's like, you know, it's like, what you got to do is you just got to convert every chord into a half diminished chord, and then it's going to sound hip. So Pat converted his chords to minor chords because he had that language nailed. He could do
Yeah.
that. You think about it, literally years playing in rock and roll and blues bands. We don't think of Pat Martino that way, but Pat was in rock and roll bands. Not even like, what we want to call, he was in like regular old, velvet tuxedo rock and roll bands in the 50s,
Right.
and so he was coming out of that. Um, and
Okay. Let's talk about feel, because the most mysterious thing that we're all trying to figure out is how to get the kind of feel that Pat Martino has. Because as much as we can talk about his fast lines and incredible articulation and interesting harmony, the thing that's most amazing to me about Pat is how he plays a ballad and how he
yeah,
swings on a slow tune. This incredibly deep sense of time that feels both incredibly on the beat and relaxed at the same time.
yeah, I would say that if there's one thing that was my objective in all of this, even in, whenever Pat and I would talk, that was always what I was trying to get to.
Yeah.
Was I wasn't really interested in Pat because of the chops, because there are plenty of guys who can play fast. It was, to me, it was this feel and how that feel connected his style, his playing to any kind of music, whether it was modern or traditional. Couple things. For me, it's essential that we think of this as a drum. That you're playing 1, 2, 3, 4, and 1, 2, 3, 4, and 1. I would even go through, a snare drum rudiments book, and not just the rhythms, but the accents. Paradiddle, 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 radamacu, radamacu, paradiddle, radamacu, paradiddle, radamacu, takadimi, 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 right? The other thing is to always, and I hate that word always, but I would say that in general, Pat and most straight ahead players are always thinking double time. Right? So you're never going 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and 1, 2. You're thinking 1, 2, 3, e, e, o, e. Even if the band's playing 2, I'm thinking you know. Even if the band's playing here.
Right.
I have a real hard time playing with a lot of modern drummers because a lot of modern drummers don't understand how far you got to lean back behind the beat for shit to swing. People would say that, playing with Von Freeman was like, playing with a ball and chain stuck to your leg. Because it was so far behind the beat. You just can't even imagine how far behind. So far behind, but it just sounded amazing, right? And spiritual sound, it just got you right away, just bam, right to the heart, right?
Well, so that is something that is so important. My question to you is for younger players who have literally never played with anybody who feels music that way. Maybe it's one day at a master class at a school or something. What are they going to do to develop that? You can play along with records, and I'm constantly, my whole life, I've been putting on Wes Montgomery records and trying to feel things like him, and it's not the same. I mean, I had the opportunity to play with some of these guys in my life, especially when I was younger, when older folks who are no longer with us, who were part of that tradition, were in the scene.
It's nothing like
But
it.
it's hard for me to know what to say to a 20-year-old who may never have played with an African American. Not that Caucasians can't swing, but that's where this tradition is coming from. So then I go on to say, well, okay, anybody who's got that feel, for whom that is their primary focus and who has lived that. And even Pat said, I don't see how anybody can learn this music in the way that I did, because the culture no longer exists in which that music lives and breathes. It was everywhere back then, and now it's more harder to access. So
I think you can make that argument for any style of music. I mean, you can make that argument for Mongolian throat singing. You can make that argument for, me being kind of in this world music tip, half of my life, and in the classical music tip, another half of my life. I know that doesn't add up, but I don't necessarily believe that to be true. I do know that even as a young player, I was more interested in the feel than I was in the chops.
I
There's
wonder I never hear that from young players. I literally have never heard that come out of a young guitarist's mouth. I've only met so many,
sure.
but so the first thing you're flagging is where you put your focus.
I think that's huge. I mean, it's funny because I don't obsess on this stuff, but as a teacher, I began to reflect on, well, what did I do back then? You know, because for 30 years at NIU, I had students, a train of students coming in every year, and I'd be like, well, what did I do, and what did I do that worked? What did I do that didn't work, and how can that help? And I remember sending in my audition tape to NIU to North Texas State, and they wanted a blues, right? And I remember playing maybe 40 or 50 takes of a blues with my thumb until I had one that felt good.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I didn't think about that at the time as being weird, but in retrospect, I'm like, oh, wow. I could play the notes, and yet if it didn't have the feeling, the sound of jazz, it didn't work for me, you know. And I can also say that feel is not something that came naturally to me. I think that's important to say. It doesn't come naturally to anybody. I think it's racist to think it does. It comes through culture. It comes through experience, right?
What
I
you
know,
grow up hearing.
yeah, I know people who are of very dark skin color who, you know, they don't have that thing, and I know other
Yes, of
folks,
course.
you know,
Yeah.
and it's not just jazz, right? It's all kinds of music. It's like, you go to Brazil and Cuba, eh, you have all kinds of mixes of ethnicities that you can't even parse it out the way we try to in America, right? And yet, there you go. And then you go to Africa, and you're like, wow, there are a lot of African musicians here, and they cannot swing at all.
Right.
They have great time and they can play great music, but they cannot swing.
Sure.
Right away, you know that now there are certain musicians in Africa that can swing, but the vast majority, they don't know from swing, right?
Yeah.
But they can play in 12 all day, right? So I think it's about priority. It's also about exposure. I know that one thing I did a lot of, and and encourage my students to do, is I would play along with records, but I wouldn't listen to the guitar player. I would play along with a record and listen to the drummer,
Mm-hmm.
listen to the bass player. I
Yeah.
would do comparative listening. I'm going to comp along with this. I'm going to imagine that I'm the bass player. Where do those notes sit in relation to the drums?
Hmm.
I'm going to imagine that I'm the drummer. Where do those notes sit in relation? And you begin to realize, man, a lot of musicians, they look at the metronome as the end all, the beginning and ending of their responsibility to the music. Like if I count off a ballad here, you know, you go to my head, boo 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 boo, dee dee da 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 dee, right? Da 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 dee, or what is it? Close your eyes. Lay your head on my shoulder and speak. Close your eyes. And I will close mine. That's behind the beat, baby.
Mm-hmm.
And if I want to play, when I comp, I'm up back on top. swing should make you laugh a little bit, right? If
Yeah.
it's really in that zone. And I don't really listen to a lot of music. I listen to a lot of comedians.
Uh-huh.
And Pat, people don't know this about Pat. He was a funny motherfucker, man. He could tell a joke, and everybody sees that kind of outside persona that he had of like the guru, the Buddha of jazz, and that's all good. But man, you close the door, and he could whip them off like the worst of them, man. It was horrible. It's awful. It was hilarious,
Uh-huh.
and he could eat a Philly cheesesteak in no time.
Right.
That was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And it's all part of the formula.
Right. Right. I think this is a great place to close. Um, this has been fantastic. I just want people also to know uh, that you have done an incredible amount of classical guitar playing. In fact, you just recorded some of my classical guitar music with Dan LaPelle.
I'm so excited,
Amazing
man.
that you can play jazz like that and play nylon string, which either one of those is enough for one lifetime. You managed to bring both in. Also, we didn't get this at the beginning, but you played with Joe Zawinul. You were in Sting's band, so very eclectic career. And I will make sure to have some of your music as a part of this when we send it out into the world, and also encourage people to look up your work and find your records.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Joel. This has been a real pleasure, a real honor, man. I really want to honor his memory, Pat's memory, because he is so important to all of us, and hopefully we can all embrace the humanity and learn from Pat.
Yeah. And where can people find the record that you made of the Joyous Lake music with your Chicago band?
We're actually in the process of remixing it. It is available on my website,
Okay.
um, Fareed.com, and you can download WAV files. I'm trying to make more of my music available in higher quality audio. I'm going to fight the MP3 to my dying breath. Um, and we're mixing it right now. Because we kind of for the thing that we did, Joe.
Yeah.
We kind of did it in a bit of a rush.
Okay.
Um, but it is available there in its current format. It sounds real good.
Okay. Great.
So
All right, man. Thanks very much.
thanks, buddy. Talk to you soon.
All right.